Paul graduated from ANU, like myself, but we are different batch. So when I finish, I think he's not finished yet, not because he's late, because he came a little bit later. And Paul has been publishing quite a lot in the field of natural resource economics and development, such as energy and then transportation. That's the thing that I remember from my head, and many more. Right? And Paul also now is editor, one of the editor of Bulletin of Indonesian Economic Studies, BIS. It's a ISI journal, and if you go to Scopus, there's a Q1 journal. Now he's going to talk about overcoming barriers to solar and wind energy adoption in Indonesia. And I think Paul is very smart. He's a bit tricky because he's discussed about barriers, obstacles. And then because if Paul live in Canberra. Canberra is a city, I live in Canberra for 4 years. Canberra is city as large as Jakarta. Can you imagine? But the population only 300,000. So can you imagine how spacious they are? So if you drive in Canberra, you won't have many barriers. Yeah? So it's not interesting. This is an analogy to many things. Yeah? In development, in policies, in economic problem, you have a less barrier. So Paul doesn't have research topic in Australia, because if you go to Bandung, that if you drive in Bandung, you will have a lot of barriers. Every 5 minutes you have to stop because of angkot. So there are so many barriers and obstacles. So Paul picked 2 countries for his research that have so many barriers in overcoming energy adoptions, which is India, and of course Indonesia will be on your agenda too, right? Yeah, and the background is Paul and his team at the ANU now has a very, very big project on low carbon development in Australia, funded by the Australian government. It's quite big because of this project. He told me that they are hiring 10 people, 10 positions at the ANU. That's a big thing. Because normally if you have a position just one in a big university like that, it's quite not common, but now he has a position for 10 projects. So maybe Paul also will talk about what this project all about too. Maybe we can get a bit of a piece of that project to work together or something. That's a good thing too. So now, before further ado, I'd like to invite Paul to come, and let's give applause to Paul. I think time is your. Sorry, before we begin, so this seminar we will start making all SDGs event very casual. Because people always complain in the university that Ministry of Higher Education or Ministry of whatever always put too much bureaucracy on us and ceremonial and administrative stuff. So why don't we start with ourselves? Let's get rid of those ceremonial things. Just go right to the point, and a fresh new year with less ceremonies. Just go to the talk and discuss. Okay, Paul, time is yours. You can do anything. You can stand up, you can sit, you can do whatever.
I will stand.
Okay.
Okay, selamat pagi. Good morning, and thank you very much to Professor Arif Yusuf for the introduction. Yeah, my name is Paul Burke, and it's great for me to be back here in Bandung and at UNPAD. I love coming back to visit UNPAD, and this is my first time to visit the SDGs Center. I have not been here for a few years, unfortunately. So it's great to be back, and thank you very much for the very kind hospitality and the introduction. Yeah, so today I'm going to be presenting on, I think it's a very exciting topic. It's energy. The world at the moment is having a revolution in energy, and this sector is booming in many countries. So I would like to share some insights about this topic and apply them for Indonesia's case. And there are many opportunities. I want to be very positive. There are many opportunities in Indonesia. So the idea with my talk is how to capture these opportunities. This is research based on qualitative analysis. I had field work in Jakarta and Delhi, India. So in this study, we draw some learnings from India. Why India? I will talk about this, but they are quite successful these days in uptake of solar and wind. And we can learn quite a lot from India's case. This is actually research with some colleagues from ANU. These are all ANU colleagues, including some early career researcher colleagues at ANU, the first two. So Ginny and Ziba, Emma Aisbert. The next one I think is a very famous face in Indonesia, Professor Budi Resosudarmo. And then finally Ken Baldwin is our project lead for our overall project that Professor Yusuf introduced, which is zero carbon energy for the Asia Pacific. The project lead is the final professor here, Ken Baldwin. Under that project, we have 5 years, and we are hoping to do a lot of good research on how to switch the energy mix from coal, natural gas, and oil to zero carbon energy. Solar, wind, geothermal, and so on. We are at the SDGs Centre, so let's start by referring to SDGs. Clean energy is relevant for many of the SDGs, right? But most relevant for SDG 7, ensure access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, modern energy for all. This also is in line with our goal as well. We want energy to be affordable. We want the lights to be on when we want them on, reliable. We need it to be clean as well, sustainable, so that the air is clean for us and that we can use the energy sustainably into the future. There are some challenges in Indonesia. First of all, some people do not have access to modern energy. According to the data, more than 20 million Indonesians do not have access to electricity in the home. Something like this. Although this number is reducing as PLN continues to expand the access. Indonesia is a success story. This number is reducing quite quickly. But still, quite a lot of people do not have access to electricity. There are also some challenges with reliability, sometimes blackout. Yeah. So moving forward, there's always challenges in every country for achieving this one, trying to have the system which is affordable, fully clean and sustainable, and reliable as well, as much as possible. The solar and wind revolution. This is a big term, big name. Do you know these days the world energy system is changing quite quickly? These days, more than 50% of net capacity additions are solar and wind. Net capacity means new capacity being put in minus capacity that is retired from the system. Old power stations that are retired. Okay. More than half of the net capacity, this is a flow, the net capacity additions in 2017 were solar and wind. Solar is the big success story. The cost has been reducing a lot. And in 2017, in terms of net capacity, there was more solar than coal, plus nuclear, plus natural gas. It's amazing. This is the new capacity additions in net capacity terms. Of course, we still use more coal for our electricity. More of our electricity is from coal than from solar and wind, of course. But how about the new investments? More and more they are going into solar and wind. This is very exciting because solar and wind are zero carbon sources of energy. Yeah. But also it creates some challenges because solar and wind are intermittent types of energy. Solar PV is only generating electricity when the sun is shining. Okay? So it does create some challenges, but these challenges can be addressed. And in my talk, I will show many pictures of the beautiful solar and wind farms. Okay? Around the world, there are many going in. How about in Indonesia? Actually, in Indonesia, there are very ambitious targets for uptake of renewables. right? So this is not SDG, this is not India, this is Indonesia's target. Indonesia has the target of renewables plus new energy reaching 23% of the energy mix by 2025. This is very ambitious. Currently, the percentage is only about 8%. So very ambitious to get to 23%. If you look in the National Energy Plan, then you can see that it is slated for about 8 gigawatts of solar and wind by 2025. It's a lot. And currently, this is very far away. This is very ambitious, this target, or this planning. But some things are starting to happen. Last year, Indonesia opened the first utility-scale wind farm in the country. You know this one? In Sidrap, South Sulawesi. There is a 75 megawatt wind farm called Sidrap Stage 1. And then there's Sidrap Stage 2 as well. So things are starting to change, starting to get put in. Why would we be motivated to make the switch to solar and wind? I think there's three main reasons. There's other reasons too, but three main ones. Number one is cheap energy. The cost of generating electricity using solar and wind is now competitive against coal or natural gas. In some countries, it's already cheaper. If the policy framework is attractive for solar and wind investments, then it can be cheaper, or much cheaper than using coal. I will show some numbers on this, but in terms of the LCOE, levelized cost of energy, solar and wind are now able to compete with coal in many countries, especially where it is sunny and windy. Yeah. Interestingly, solar and wind, building a new solar and wind, is now able to compete with the variable cost of coal, the operating costs of coal. So now building a new solar farm, for example, is able to outcompete the existing coal-fired power station. Remember, coal-fired power station, you must buy coal every year. You must buy water or access water every year. You must do maintenance every year. Actually, it's expensive. The cheapest solar farms are able to undercut the cost of running some coal-fired power stations, right? So it's actually very exciting, cheap energy. Number two is clean air. Local air pollution is a big challenge in many places, including in Indonesia. And the electricity sector is a big contributor to air pollution. The coal generators are releasing emissions. The number that I found suggests that more than 78,000 people in Indonesia died due to outdoor air pollution. That's quite a lot of people, and it's a very sad story. Some other cities like Delhi, or compared to Jakarta, some cities have worse pollution, like Delhi. The pollution can be very, very, very serious. So the issue to consider is, does Indonesia want to have the pollution getting worse and worse, or take the different path and trying to have a very green, low pollution country that's good for the local people? Number three, and this is very important, is to fight global climate change. Yeah. This century, that means by 2100, it is possible that the world will have had 2 degrees global warming, or 3 degrees global warming, or maybe 4 degrees global warming. We already have had 1. This is very serious, and very serious for a country like Indonesia. If there is 3 degrees global warming, for example, this is a disaster, right? There will be more very hot days, which leads to humans having many health problems and increased chance of death. There is more cyclones and tropical storms. Sea is rising, causing challenges for cities like Jakarta. It's a serious problem, and the world has a big opportunity to reduce emissions a lot, by just switching from coal to solar, natural gas to wind, for example. This graph is showing the cost conditions for solar and wind. This is numbers for the United States because the US has very good numbers. Okay, so this is not for Indonesia. This one is showing LCOE. LCOE is levelized cost of energy. This is the cost of generating electricity, and it includes capital cost plus operating cost, variable cost. And it's for building the new plant, the new electricity generation plant. So this number is useful for making the decision, should we build the new coal or the new wind? The biggest story in energy for the last decade is costs of wind and especially solar have reduced a lot. This is the world's biggest story for energy. Also, cost of batteries are reducing as well. Especially for solar, this one here, you can see the very, very steep reduction in the cost of generating electricity using solar. A key reason for this is solar panels are getting more efficient and are being produced at the larger scale, so there are economies of scale. China is producing them pretty cheaply. This is helping to reduce the cost a lot. Also, market mechanisms have been used that help to bring the cost down a lot, and the cost of finance is reducing as well. This is for the United States, where solar and wind are now able to outcompete coal and be competitive against operating coal-fired power stations. So building new wind or solar can be competitive against operating the existing coal-fired power station. I will show some numbers for India of the cost price reductions as well coming up. How about the potential? The world has massive potential for using solar power. It's very sunny. The world is a sunny place. Not everywhere is so sunny, like Ireland and England, not quite so sunny. But Indonesia is not the best place in the world for solar. It's not. So, the desert area in Africa or in Australia has more solar coming down. But Indonesia is still pretty good. There's massive opportunity for solar power production in Indonesia because there's a lot of sunlight coming down and there's adequate space around Indonesia for solar panels. So this map is showing the solar conditions. Red is the better area for solar. So we can see, for example, in Australia, in the desert area, outback area, that's very suitable for solar. Indonesia is shown in mainly yellow here. So that's a middle sort of potential, but still much better than Northern Europe, for example, where in winter it is the grey sky. Indonesia has the advantage, it does not have the winter, the serious winter, compared to Europe. So it's not as seasonal. This is very good for solar. So actually Indonesia has a vast potential for solar. For wind, Indonesia's potential is actually lower. It's not so windy here. But Indonesia still has wind. And some areas are still suitable for onshore and offshore wind generation. But Indonesia is much more suited to solar than for wind. Okay? So still has wind and the big potential to have more wind farms. But solar is even stronger in the potential. We can see that here. Indonesia is in the blue, which is in the weaker area. Still has wind, but not as strong as when you go near the poles, then it tends to be windier. Okay, so some places like Scotland have very strong wind. Denmark, very windy. Indonesia still has, but we must be serious, it's not as strong. But still can have big potential for wind relative to how much we need. Okay, so in this paper we do India versus Indonesia. The first question is why India versus Indonesia? As I will show soon, India has had the big success these days in uptake of solar and wind. And they have had the long history of trying to be successful in this sector. These two countries, actually, you know, there are some similarities. There's differences as well, but some similarities. King is coal. Coal is king, maybe we should say. They have, in India, they use a lot of coal as well. So similar to Indonesia. You know, actually, India is remarkably close to Indonesia. We don't always, for Australia, we don't always think it's so close. You know, that India has some islands here, very close to Aceh, pretty close to Aceh. Cannot swim, but a bit close. These islands here in green, this is the Nicobar and Andaman Islands of India. Yeah. Of course, this area is very far from Indonesia, but still, India is a neighboring country, relatively close to Indonesia. Yeah, it's pretty amazing. There are many other similarities, India and Indonesia. Electricity use per capita is about the same. The two countries are really similar. In some ways, India is more complicated than Indonesia. India has states, and energy is a concurrent power. That means the states have a power for energy, to manage energy, and the central government as well. So each state has a utility for electricity. Indonesia has PLN. PLN is really a very centralized institution. It has a divisional office, but is still one state-owned enterprise. So actually, Indonesia is easier for managing the energy sector than India. That's interesting, I think. Here are some comparisons. India and Indonesia, both highly dependent on coal, and both are extracting the coal. Yeah. Indonesia is a net exporter of coal, of course, the world's #2 exporter. India is not like this, but still it is really reliant on coal, domestic and imported. One interesting thing, India has much stronger electricity grid interconnection across the country. It's not perfect, but they have the good interconnections. Whereas Indonesia has a very weak interconnections across the country. There are separate grids around the country. Of course, Indonesia is more challenging because there's different islands. Yeah, there's a difference. But that's an important point to note. I mentioned this one already. India, many utilities. Indonesia, basically PLN. India has the advantage of having some desert area and some areas with, we can say, maybe spare land, suitable for solar. Whereas Java, island of Java, is very crowded and not so much spare space, except on the rooftop. There's a lot of spare space on the rooftop. Yeah, I noticed when I was flying into Bandung, lots of spare rooftop. So this is an advantage for India. They have lots of land in the sunny areas, and the sunny area, they're quite conveniently located. Rajasthan is not so far from Delhi and other populated areas. Whereas Indonesia, it's more land constrained, especially in the place where most people live, Java. It's land constrained, and land is expensive. Some other differences and similarities as well. First of all, I must say in India they have a very strong research capacity on energy. Very impressive and strong. They have, for example, they have TERI, the Energy and Resource Institute. They have very good researchers on energy, and these are not just economists, they are engineers and many good researchers. Indonesia, for energy, the research capacity still is developing, and it can be improved a lot. That is one very noticeable difference when visiting Jakarta and when visiting Delhi. Both countries have some challenges with land access. It can be difficult to acquire the land to do the project. So some similarities and some differences. Both countries have been very successful in some ways. For example, improving electricity access. It's a big success story and it's great. For example, Indonesia here, this is the percentage of the population who can access electricity in the home. And these numbers are from the IEA. These numbers are not perfect, but they are close. We can see both countries has had the increase in the electricity access. And it's pretty quick, from 2000 to 2016. It's not a long time. Indonesia, for example, has gone from 50-something% of people having electricity to more than 80%, getting to more than 90%. It's great. So there has been real success in some areas. How about for solar and wind? This graph is showing the percentage of the electricity mix from solar plus wind. Okay. First of all, let's go for India. Starting at 0. Is now up to 5% as of 2017 and increasing quite quickly. So still the minority. Most of the electricity is from coal. Okay, and they have other electricity, hydro and other. But increasing pretty quickly, right? It's quite hard to change the electricity system, and total demand is increasing quickly. This is quite a big increase in wind plus solar. How about for Indonesia? Do you know what the line will look like? Shall we do it? This is not exactly 0, this one. But if we round it to the nearest decimal, it's 0.0. Yeah? It's 0. Yeah. So this one is just solar plus wind. I have not included geothermal and hydro and bio in this one. If we include geothermal and hydro, then Indonesia is looking better because it has 4% from geothermal and it has some hydro as well. Okay. But let's just focus on solar and wind. The key reason why focusing on this is these are the two hot technologies in the world. And yeah, geothermal is great as well. My point is not to say the negative thing about geothermal. It's great. And it's important to understand that Indonesia has focused more on that technology than these ones. Okay? Yeah. India's, the percentage that India gets from total renewables, I have to check the number. Okay? It's more than 10 or it's more than 12%, but I need to check to get the exact number. Yeah. They get 0 from geothermal, but they have 0 from geothermal, but they have hydro and bio. So I have to check it. How about Indonesia's electricity mix? This is the mix in 2016. Coal is more than 50%. Hey, this is similar to Australia as well. Australia was more than 80%, but coal is falling quickly. These days in Australia, coal is about 60%, still more than Indonesia. So you know Australia and Indonesia, we have the similarities as well. Indonesia has natural gas, uses more natural gas for electricity than India. A little bit of oil. This one is especially diesel in the outer islands. Is used for electricity generation. Indonesia also has geothermal, about 4%. Solar and wind is not 0, but it's very, very small. My prediction is this one will be increasing, but of course, coal will be still the dominant one for some years. Okay. But coal is having some challenges as well. The economics of coal around the world are being challenged by the new technologies. Wind, solar, storage. So what about solar and wind generating capacity? In India, it is 51 gigawatts. Okay, pretty big. How about Indonesia? It's less than 0.1 gigawatt. It's small. Just opening the first wind capacity in South Sulawesi. Solar is still small. Yeah, but it's growing quickly from a very low base. A base that was close to 0. Both countries have very ambitious targets for uptake. I mentioned Indonesia already. India's one is amazing. 160 gigawatts, they want to reach 160 gigawatts by 2022. They're already on 51. So that's very rapid. They want to put in a lot very quickly. Okay? And how are they doing it? They're doing it through, this is a picture of Indonesia. This is Sidrap. It's a very beautiful wind farm, I think. India is doing it with wind farm as well, but also large-scale solar park like this. And this, of course, is the Indian Prime Minister Modi welcoming the world to look at this new solar park. There are quite a few new solar parks going in India. Big ones. All right, so how about the institutional scene in India? They've had a long history of setting the foundations for this sector. For example, in 1992, they established the world's first ministry for, at that time it was called non-conventional energy sources. Later, the ministry changed to Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. So they have the whole ministry for renewables. It's a serious institution. This one is an important one. In 2010, they announced just look at the last two words, solar mission. Mission means they launched a big program for solar, national program to try to increase solar a lot. This is a serious government target or goal program. And they established a state-owned enterprise, this one, Solar Energy Corporation of India. Well, this is a corporation owned by the central government, and it does procurement of solar and many other activities related to solar. In other words, India has set up the government institutions for this sector, solar and wind. They also have some research agencies and data provision agencies, for example, the National Institute of Solar Energy. Okay. Indonesia is a bit different to this. Not as much focus on solar and wind from the government level. When we look at India, there's three key parts to their success these days. And again, at the moment, the big projects are being built, so the sector currently is booming in India. First of all, first key is strong facilitation by governments. The government has given a big priority to solar and wind and has sought to facilitate these markets by setting up the solar mission and by doing the big procurement processes for solar and wind. So number one thing is the Prime Minister and the previous Prime Minister gave the big priority to this. Number two is they use the market mechanism. Often the success comes from government and market together. So number two is they use the market mechanism. The mechanism is called reverse auction. It's a procurement bidding process. Reverse auction means they say we want to have the solar capacity installed in our country. Please submit your bid. Private sector, please submit your bid for the price that you would need to receive to supply electricity from your facility. And so they announced the reverse auction. Reverse auction means the private sector puts in the bids and they choose the cheapest bids. Indonesia runs this as well. The tender exercise is called tendering. Reverse auction is the term used for this type of mechanism. So in auctions, standard auction is like the house auction. The buyer is doing the bidding, and the bidding goes up, and the seller accepts the highest price. Like for house auction, right? Everyone is bidding, and the seller accepts the highest price. Reverse auction is the opposite one. The supplier is bidding, and the other side of the market accepts the lowest price. This is just like tender process. If you are buying some tables, you get the quote or you ask for tender and you, holding quality constant, you buy the cheapest tables. It's reverse. So another word for it is tender or getting quotes or bidding. formal one is reverse auction. They open it up to a big marketplace. And for these reverse auctions, the winner of the auction signed the power purchasing agreement, PPA. Indonesia also has power purchasing agreement. So these auctions are a mechanism for getting power purchasing agreements at the lowest price possible. And as we will see soon, they have got the very low price from this mechanism. Lots of competition. Yeah, so for an economist, it looks very exciting. This is a market that's getting lots of competition and bringing the price down. Third key point is India has tried to reduce the risk and to make the market attractive to investors. They don't want to have the very high price. They want to have the low price and lots of competition. A key way to do it is to remove the risk for the investments. For example, one key risk for solar park is how do we get the land if we want to set up the solar farm. India tried to reduce this risk. They set up the solar park, big solar park, and then they lease out the land in the solar park to the solar companies. In other words, they removed the challenge of getting the land. And so they removed the challenge of getting the land from the solar investors. They set up SECI, the Solar Energy Corporation of India, set up the solar park. And then they have the auction, and the solar companies just need to install and operate the capacity. So, in other words, it reduces the risk for the solar investors. If the risk is reduced, then we can get the lower price when they are bidding in the reverse auction. So, a key thing is that the government has tried to make the auctions attractive and make the facilitating environment for low bids, for cheap projects. Also, they've tried to make it so that the solar parks are having the transmission connection, right? So it removes the headache for the solar investors. They know there's a park there, transmission connection there, PPA contract is there. What price do they need? It makes it much easier for the investor side. That helps them to get the low price. Without these things, the price can be high, too expensive. You can only get, these days, you can only get a competitive price for solar and wind if you have the good investment environment. This is a big challenge for Indonesia because investment environment is more difficult. There are regulations from the government and there's difficulty acquiring the land and other risks. These risks mean the projects are more expensive. Okay, so these are the three key things. Government gave the priority. Government used the market mechanism, reverse auction, and they tried to make the investment environment attractive. In other words, they tried to facilitate the sector so that it can have competition and have the low price project. In economics, one of the most exciting thinkers about market development these days, do you know her? Professor Mariana Mazzucato. She's at LSE, London. She has written the book, The Entrepreneurial State. This model that India has followed is consistent with her economics logic. Government and market should go hand in hand. Government can set some target and goals and try to make the investment situation attractive by removing regulation and trying to overcome some market barriers. And then let the market compete and have the low price. State and market, they go hand in hand. And in India's solar and wind sectors, that has been true. All right, so here is the reverse auction prices from India, and this is for solar. And this scale is in Indian rupees per kilowatt hour. Don't worry about the currency. I will convert it to US dollars and compare to the Indonesian case. This is showing the minimum price that was bid in each year for solar contracts, solar projects. to build the utility scale solar farms. Check it out. Started expensive and every year has been getting cheaper and cheaper. Why cheaper and cheaper? Panels from China are getting cheaper and cheaper, China and elsewhere. The investment situation is getting more attractive. The industry is developing and maturing. The learning curve is bringing down the cost. This cost is very cheap, US 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour to supply electricity over the next 25 or so years. This 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour is not indexed to inflation. It's not adjusted for currency movements. It's just a set price for the next 25 years. It's cheap. How about for wind? The cheapest wind project in 2017 came in at the same, basically the same price as solar. Getting cheap. How to compare to Indonesia? Indonesia, the average cost of generating electricity in Indonesia is called BPP. Yeah? This is the average cost of generating electricity across all of Indonesia. And Indonesia also has BPP for each region, but for all of Indonesia. Where is it on this graph for 2017? Here. Average cost of generating in Indonesia was US 7.66 cents. So these solar and wind projects in India are coming in below average cost of generation in Indonesia. You can see the potential here. The Indian new projects are cheaper than the average in Indonesia. There's a potential. If Indonesia did a reverse auction, Indonesia would not get this low price because the market conditions are not ready for it. And the investment environment is not as attractive as India. There's no solar park sitting there. There are investment risks. But that is the point. The Indonesian government could try to make the situation more attractive for the investors, to try to achieve the Indian success of getting the low price project. All right. The cost of, so this one is the cost of building the new solar and wind in India. It is cheaper than some of the existing coal-fired costs. So the BPP for India, I need to check the exact number, but it's higher than this. The current generating cost is higher than these new projects that are coming in. Coal is quite expensive. In India, they have to transport the coal around on the long train lines, right? The coal situation is more challenging in India. Right? Indonesia does have more coal. That's a relevant point. These new projects are cheaper than many of the existing projects and cheaper than new coal-fired power stations. How about in Indonesia? What are some of the key challenges? I don't want to go through all of them, but just some key ones. One is in Indonesia, for solar, let me focus on solar and wind. For solar and wind projects, they operate on BOOT, build, own, operate, transfer. At the end of the project, you must give the project to PLN. This does create some big headaches and cost increases. If you have a solar park in your palm oil plantation, let's just say, your palm oil plantation, at the end of the contract, do you want to give your land back to PLN, over to PLN? You don't want to do it, right? Or if you have a solar park on big rooftop areas, do you want to give the rooftop to PLN at the end of the project? You don't want to do it. First principle of business is try not to give your assets away to the government. This is a big disincentive to investing. BOOT can make sense in some situations if it's a government solar park and you're just leasing for 25 years and giving it back at the end. You know the rules of the game. It's okay. But if the BOOT is applying to your existing assets and investments on them, it's very serious as a disincentive to investment. No one wants to give the project and the land or the rooftop space or something like this to the government after the end of the project. There are other issues for Indonesia. Currently, Indonesia has domestic market obligation, DMO, for coal. It means that 25% of coal extraction must go to domestic electricity, with the price cap at US $70 per tonne coal or below for lower grades of coal. In other words, coal is being put into the system at the below cost price. It makes it hard for solar and wind to compete, right? At the same time, coal mines get some advantages like the tax exemptions and things like this, or tax allowances, things like this. So there are some challenges for solar and wind to compete on a level playing field. Indonesia has domestic content requirements for solar projects. So if you're using solar projects, you must get some parts from domestically. It increases costs. Domestic panels are more expensive than the overseas panels. We don't want anything that increases costs. Ideally, we would want the projects to be low cost and attractive. It's better for the installation industry, which has many jobs potentially, and it's better for consumers. Indonesia also has a price cap on new renewables projects. There's a regulation that in some areas, the price of renewables projects is capped at 85% of the regional BPP. In other words, the new wind and solar projects must outcompete the existing generation because the price has been capped at the 85% of the local BPP, cost of generation. Well, there's lots of headaches for wind and solar, right? Coal is at the low price, and then they must outcompete this coal. In Indonesia, one key point is regulatory uncertainty. The regulations change, and the industry has often mentioned this. The rules change, they have to redesign the project, it adds to costs. And it means investors are less interested in Indonesia. If I was a solar investment company, would I want to invest in Indonesia? Probably not, actually. Yeah, I'll go somewhere else. There are many opportunities. In Indonesia, there are also some issues with licensing and negotiating with PLN. Ideally, the grid would be, as much as possible, an open access, attractive investment opportunity. You can build a project and feed it in. But in Indonesia, there are some challenges. To sell electricity, you need to have the PPA with PLN, the power purchasing agreement with PLN. And there are some negotiation issues, and it can take a long time, and it's quite unattractive to the investors. There are some other smaller problems, like for rooftop solar, we need to get the net meter. This industry is still a small industry, but sometimes getting the net meter can be challenged. PLN office does not have the net meter for you and things like this. This will improve, I'm sure. This is not the criticism. It will improve. But there's some challenges. Why in Indonesia is the progress slow? There are some reasons, of course. Just one case study on this. In 2017, Indonesia had the procurement process, started the procurement process for solar in Sumatra. They did the pre-qualification round and got the investor interest. And then they did not release the results even 12 months afterwards. The results were not released at that time. So the industry is left wondering, what happened to my information I submitted? This type of thing leads to reducing the investment excitement about Indonesia. All right, so let's go for some positive ideas. Let's try some. And I would like this to be discussion, so I wonder what you think about these ideas. We can have Q&A. Here's some ideas. Some may be good ones. Okay, let's try them. First of all, what can we learn from India? One thing is they had some success with the solar parks. Acquiring the land can be very difficult in India and Indonesia because there can be many small landowners. Can be complications, who owns the land and so on. Government procuring some land area and setting up the solar park works quite well. And then lease out the area in the solar park for the solar installations. This could work in Indonesia as well. It worked well in India. This is a picture of a solar park in India. I interviewed one of the investors. It's working quite well, and it helps to reduce the cost by overcoming land issues. This could help to generate substantial investment interest. Question is where to locate the solar park. In our paper, we discussed maybe there's some degraded agricultural area or former coal mining area, especially off Java, especially Kalimantan and so on. These could be suitable for solar park. Yeah. Ideally, find the best and cheapest and most suitable land, and the land near the transmission line, suitable for solar park. So that's one idea. Have the solar park and then have the reverse auction. And try to make it the exciting one. Try to get lots of investor interest. Hey, we have this, we're starting solar in Indonesia, we have the large solar park, come and invest here. And then see what happens. Other countries have seen the low prices. Can Indonesia have this as well? We can see. Here's another policy idea. And this is also from India. In environmental economics, one of the classic tools, instruments, is RPO scheme, Renewable Portfolio Obligation Scheme, RPO. It's called Green Certificate Scheme. Quite a few countries have this, including Australia. We have it as well. We have this scheme. If you have a renewables target, then this type of scheme is a mechanism for achieving the target. How does the scheme work? The scheme would require PLN to purchase or acquire the green certificates. Green certificates represent renewable generation. If you generate renewable electricity, you also create the green certificate. PLN would have to have a certain amount of green certificates, and the quantity would be consistent with the Indonesian target. This is a market mechanism set up by governments. So Australia's government has set up a mechanism like this. India has a mechanism like this as well. Does it make sense? So PLN would have to have a certain amount of green certificates representing a certain quantity of renewables. This market creates the demand for renewables and helps to ensure that the quantity target for renewables is met. One idea is that compliance with the RPO scheme could be a KPI, key performance indicator, for the board of PLN. Okay, if currently PLN is not so interested in renewables, solar and wind, how to change this? One way is to include it among KPIs of the board of PLN. Yeah? That way the incentive is not just for the institution, but it's for the individuals as well. This is a very simple system, green certificates. And you know, PLN could have the reward if they achieve the target. They could have some financial reward. India has used this type of approach. For utilities achieving some certain solar uptake target, they get the bonus. Key thing is to create the incentives so that the utility does not just ignore solar and wind, so that the utility is starting to want to encourage solar and wind. This type of scheme is much easier to implement in Indonesia than in India. Indonesia has some advantages. Why so easy? It's just PLN, basically just PLN. So compliance is much easier. In India, they have many states, it's very huge, and the states can ignore the central. So compliance is much more difficult. Another policy idea. Over recent years, Indonesia has had some success in reducing fossil fuel subsidies and electricity subsidies. right? In 2014, Indonesia's on the budget, Indonesia had more than 300 trillion rupiahs of energy subsidy. This has been reduced to less than 100 in 2017. Not fully reduced, not fully eliminated, but reduced. Some reforms. What were the reforms? Fuel price was put up. And electricity prices for some consumers were put up as well. This helps solar and wind actually. Because these subsidies, for example, if the price of electricity is too low, then we are less likely to put rooftop solar on the roof. If electricity price is higher, we are more likely to switch to rooftop solar in our house. In Australia, more than 20% of households now have rooftop solar. In Indonesia, it's very small. One of the reasons is electricity is subsidized in Indonesia. This subsidy is not helping the solar sector. Another example is cheap gasoline and diesel. Would you want to buy an electric car and use it, charge it from your solar panel? If gasoline is so cheap, premium is so cheap, then you can forget about electric car, right? If the price is the suitable price with no subsidy, you're more likely to get electric car. Also, try to reduce the subsidies flowing to coal industry as well. That would help solar and wind. Another idea from India is coal tax. India has levied the coal tax for some years. It's quite a good one. It raises money for the budget, and the budget can be used for good activities. Coal tax helps solar and wind compete. Why coal tax? Coal is the most polluting fossil fuel and leads to many deaths. So economists normally argue it makes sense to tax the negative externality. There are other options, of course, carbon tax, emissions trading scheme, yeah. But coal tax is a good start, actually. It has worked well, quite well in India, so it could be used in Indonesia as well. And Indonesia previously has done some thinking about this. Ministry of Finance did the Green Paper in 2009 on carbon pricing. So there's already some thinking about this topic, and it's a potential. Here's another idea. I wonder what you think about it. How about Indonesian Clean Energy Agency? Or something like this. Some name. Please think of a better name than this. A lot of countries have gone for some agencies which prioritize renewables. Including Australia, we have some relevant agencies. Yeah. What could this type of agency do? It could try to break the deadlock, try to make renewables more strong institutionally. There are many activities that this type of agency or agencies could do. For example, it could run the reverse auctions, right? Like in India, they have SECI, which runs reverse auctions. It could set up the solar park. Could. It could, if there is a renewable portfolio obligation scheme, it could help to administer it. Okay. It could do some planning. Renewables need some planning of the grid and other things. It could help. It could do training, help to have capacity training for solar technologies and wind technologies and maintaining the grid when there's intermittent renewables on the grid. Yeah, could. There is a lot of finance in the world for green projects, including the concessional finance from related to climate change targets, right? So this agency could help to get Indonesian access to some of the cheap finance available from the international community. This agency could also do some investments in research and development. It's very important for solar and wind to understand how to use it in the local conditions and manage the grid in the local situation. Finally, providing data is very important. Investors would like to know in every location, how is the solar condition through the year? How is the wind condition? If they have good data, they can get a much cheaper finance from the bank. The agency could help provide. I wonder what you think of this type of idea. Please provide feedback later. Again, a lot of countries go for this type of approach. And this type of approach has been considered in Indonesia as well. Actually, all of the ideas I'm mentioning have been considered in Indonesia as well. These are not the radical ideas, really. Boosting research capacity. India has a lot of researchers on energy. Indonesia could have some more capacity compared to other countries. When we look at Indonesia, I think it's fair to say this. So maybe there's some scope for some investment in research capacity for energy sector. India has this agency, TERI. So maybe some additional investment in Indonesia would help to catch up towards India. All right, just a couple more ideas, then I will wrap up. Then we should go for Q&A. A key topic is this one: protectionism, or self-reliance, self-sufficiency. Solar technologies are getting cheap, but if you try to produce it yourself, it's not cheap. The best way to get the cheap solar is to buy it from the international market. And of course, the local industry will develop as well. And the local supply chain participation will develop as well. You want that to happen. But the key goal should be to get cheap solar panels. And then the local installation industry can grow, local consumers can benefit. The cheapest and best solar panels are from overseas, from China and elsewhere as well, Germany and elsewhere. Total employment in renewables would benefit from having the big installation industry. So there are some options for Indonesia. For example, there is currently a tariff on solar imports. One option is to reduce or remove the tariff. Okay? It helps to have the low. If you do this, the cost of solar projects will fall. Also, domestic content requirements. There are some reasons for them, but as far as possible, reducing the requirements would allow the projects to become cheaper, which would benefit Indonesia, the local country, right? If the trade restrictions are too high, then the solar and wind industry might not develop at all, and so there's no benefit. If they are kept as low as possible, then the industry is going to develop more quickly, and that would provide more benefit, including to local solar producers, panel makers, and parts makers. So this is quite an important one, trying to be as open to international trade as possible. A couple more key issues. One is how to manage renewables on the grid, solar and wind. Currently, Indonesia has very little solar and wind, so it's not much problem. But if they go for more and more, then the challenge will grow bigger and bigger. But this challenge can be managed. The key challenge is how to store the energy so that you will still have energy at nighttime and when the wind is not blowing as well, but especially at nighttime. One approach to do the storage is batteries. Another approach is pumped hydro. Do you know pumped hydro? Pumped hydro means during the daytime when the sun is shining, you're generating a lot of electricity. You pump the water up. At nighttime, the water comes down, turns the turbine, generates electricity at nighttime. It's so basic and so cool. Just use the water and use elevation. One advantage of Indonesia is there's a lot of elevation. There's a lot of hills and mountains, right? So for pumped hydro, Indonesia is a dream place. Perfect place. Better than some other places. Pumped hydro is currently the key storage technology, and Indonesia is a very suitable place for pumped hydro. I'm talking about off-river pumped hydro. Basically, all you need for it is one reservoir here, another reservoir up the hill. Higher is better. And you need some water. But the water does not need to be too much. It just goes up and down and so on. Keeps being cycled. There are some other issues for managing. For example, improved interconnectivity would help solar and wind. If it's not sunny here, it might be sunny here. So it's good to have the grid that's connected, and so on. One thing for pumped hydro, some colleagues at ANU have done the mapping for Indonesia. Where are some suitable places for pumped hydro? All you need is the distance, a vertical distance like this. And they excluded the national park or the special places. Okay. Indonesia has so many. The red dots are the areas with very good pumped hydro conditions. There are many, many, many suitable places, and they have not mapped all parts of Indonesia. There are many suitable places for pumped hydro here. So that's quite a suitable technology. One exciting thing is it's not just the government. The private sector can lead on this too. Some companies, including through this initiative, are promising to go to only renewable energy. More and more companies are signing to this. So they have the demand for renewables, but the market is not ready to supply them much renewables yet. This is where the government comes in. It's important to supply an attractive investment environment for renewables, so that the companies can access cheap wind and solar. Okay, just finally, rooftop solar I think has a big potential in Indonesia. It's true, Java does not have the big open areas for solar park. Right? There's some area, but it's a bit challenging. Indonesia has a lot of roofs that can be used for solar installations. Right? And in future, buildings could be built with a strong roof, good connection, and then utilize that space. Currently, rooftop, it's just not being used much, right? And in Australia as well, there's some empty rooftop space. As solar gets cheaper and cheaper, it's a good idea to use the rooftop space as much as possible. There are some other issues which I'm happy to talk about in Q&A. There are some other challenges for solar and wind. But hopefully we have covered quite a lot of topics for India. I'll just leave with these two key insights. Number one is government prioritization is important. Number two is let's use the market. Set up the low risk reverse auction process and then get the market excited. And that's the way to get the very cheap prices for solar and wind. Okay, thank you very much for listening to me. Thank you very much. Terima kasih.
Thanks, Paul. You may have a rest. You can stand up again later.
Thank you.
By the way, thank you, Paul. I think you can sense the feel, at least the enthusiasm of the presentation. Of course, the substance of the presentation is very important. Yeah, and this is also a policy paper, so Paul is considering submitting to the energy policy, if I'm correctly. So this kind of presentation can be also has outlet for good publication. We just get rejected by energy policy last week, actually.
Oh, really?
Sorry to hear. And what I mean is. Not really related to the topic, but I can say that you are very enthusiastic on the topic as well. Right? So this is, if you are doing policy paper, you can very get enthusiastic because it's not only about research, but also making an impact. Yeah? And then, and renewable energy is very crucial because of the problem of climate change that we have now. So this is the area where we are academic can as well has making an impact not only in terms of H index, Scopus H index, but also making change to people's life. So I have a lot of questions myself, but I will not becoming the first one to ask. So I'm going to let you guys have the first opportunity because this is a rare opportunity for us to have Paul here. So I will give you guys several rounds of questions, so 3 every rounds, or maybe just direct questions to him. You just raise your hand and then introduce yourself, your name and where you're from, and then ask questions about anything that Paul presented here. So I'll give you one first round. Please go ahead. Yes, raise your hand.
Should I use the microphone?
Yeah, sure. Maybe gimana mekanismenya?
Sebelah situ aja, Pak.
Oh, we are kepelem katanya. Karena we are also just for your information, we are running live on Facebook and Instagram. So we are also hoping that some people who are following us on social media also can give also questions, and we're looking forward to that.
First of all, thank you for the presentation. My name's Reza. I'm from ITB. I don't have a strong background on economics, but I do study a bit about technology. So my question is, you've been talking a lot about large actors, like large investors, but I want to ask about how big or how important is the participation of the smaller users of solar and wind. For example, as a part of my studies, I've been doing an internship on the TML energy. Yeah, it's a short internship, but anyways, yeah, they've been doing some projects, maybe small, 168 kilowatts recently installed in the military base, and then another larger one, 1 megawatt on the Honda manufacturing plant. Either way, is it important to make it more interesting for smaller players? For example, by allowing them to sell the energy instead of only net metering. How important is that compared to the larger players? Thank you.
Interesting question. You might want to respond right away, or just wait?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Directly,
Yeah, good question. I think small is vital. And in Australia's case, we started with small. And then the industry built up, and then they could move to large as well. Yeah. So I think very much think that small is important on government buildings, on industry buildings, and rooftop. And batteries are getting cheaper and cheaper. So these days in Australia, some households are putting in batteries as well. So for developing the industry, I think small is very important. How to help the small? One way to help the small is the RPO scheme that I mentioned, Renewable Portfolio Obligation Scheme. Actually, in Australia, we have still a scheme like this that encourages a certain quantity of small-scale solar PV every year. This is one way to build the market. Another way is to make sure access to the grid and selling the energy is attractive. So, yes, I agree with your point. Ideally, the small scale and medium scale, they would be able to sell to the buyer who wants the energy at the suitable price and be able to feed in at the suitable price. Last year, Indonesia introduced regulation on this, net metering regulation. So this is okay, this is a good step. It helps to make it clear that you can reduce your electricity bill by putting solar on the rooftop. And in future, maybe it will become even more attractive. But yeah, very important, small scale.
Great. I hope it answered those your question. Next, do you have any questions? Not yet? Maybe Susi, silakan.
Thank you very much, Paul. My name is Susiana from SDG Center. You talk about land occupation in India. It's not problem at all for the solar development there. But actually in Indonesia, land is a problem actually. We have hard to find land and how it is what they call how we can find land for the solar installation. I'd like to know how is this the contract between the government and the what they call the what they call for investor here. Yeah, about the land.
Okay, thank you very much. It's true that finding suitable land is more challenging in Indonesia. But there's rooftop. Also, at the moment, there is one project for floating solar on the water body, like a dam or small lake. It's possible to have floating solar. Remember, the technology is getting better and better. And so you can utilize a lot of different spaces, including agricultural space. Between the crop can be suitable for solar. Or even above some crops they grow, and the panel can be above. Also, Indonesia does have some suitable space, for example, the former coal mine space, although the location may be not convenient. I think that as the industry develops in Indonesia, it will not quite be so many big solar parks like in India, but more and more rooftop. But yeah, there are some suitable spaces in Indonesia, so it can be utility scale, but also in Indonesia, I think more and more will use rooftop or maybe floating. India's solar parks, the government did not provide the land for free. You lease the land if you are wanting to build the solar park. You have a lease agreement for the land. So what India did was they set up the park. They purchased the land from the previous farmers or land users. And they set up the park certain size. And then they leased the area in the park. So why did the government get involved? Because the government could reduce the headache for the investors and make sure that the park was suitable size, big enough. And it seemed to be quite a good approach. Of course, the private sector can set up the park as well. In India, they have private solar parks. So it might happen in Indonesia as well. One more thing on it is some of the suitable places for the solar park are, for example, Sumatra. So if there is the interconnection from Sumatra to Java, it helps, because then the solar park could be located away from Java and link and still sell the power to the Java market. So government investment in interconnector would also help to have the solar park located elsewhere.
Okay, any more questions? Robi, silakan. Sini aja, coba ke film.
Okay, good morning. My name is Robi from SD Center. So it was a very interesting presentation. I would like to ask about the, during the past last year, I have been working with PLN to develop the document called ESMS, Environmental and Social Management System. This is one of the documents required by the lender before they give the decision whether they want to invest in the developing the power plant or not. So from my experience, solar energy or wind energy is not an option at all for PLN. So they are prefer to extend the existing power plant. For example, in Aceh or in Indramayu, they try to extend the PLTG, yeah, and yeah, okay. So they prefer to extend the existing power plant. So I just want to ask you about how it was implemented in India, whether this result that you have already shown is start from the government first, or from the NGO, for example, or from the academician. Because from my opinion, from the government point of view, it seems that there is no political will from the governments to develop the alternative energy. So I just want to ask you about that. Yes, thank you.
It's a very good question. A key requirement is the government vision and the government prioritization. So if the government really wants it, like in India, then it can set up the mechanism to get it. That's one key lesson from India, is that the government really led the process, not the utilities, the government. It's true that PLN so far does not have many solar and wind. And there are some reasons for this, of course. Solar and wind makes some challenges for them. To get the very low price, the government would need to facilitate it and have the strong target and mechanism. And ideally, PLN needs to have the incentive flipped. Currently, their incentive may be to ignore solar and wind, not have much. But if there was some incentive for PLN to be very active in establishing solar and wind, then this would change the equation. How to do this? One is RPO scheme. RPO scheme requires solar and wind. Two is could be some financial mechanism to give the bonus to PLN or compensation or investment funds if they meet the solar and wind target. Three is PLN, maybe they want to go into solar market because many households in Indonesia may be interested in putting in solar panels. So there can be many models for it, but I agree with your summary. So far PLN is not quite so keen. But still, the fact is the fact, solar and wind has the potential to be cheaper and to be the benefit of the people, especially as we move forward in time, in the future. So how to change the situation? There are some reforms that would help. Make sure that the coal price is not suppressed at the low level. Make sure that there's some mechanism to meet the government target. Who needs to be the leader? It should be firstly the government. So it needs to have the very strong vision from the very top of the government.
Great. Silakan.
Thank you. My name is Amin Jihadi. I come from environmental science. I want to ask about the electronic waste. Industry 4.0 is making increased electronic waste potentially. By using the solar energy, we're increasing electronic waste because it uses a lot of battery. What do you think about this? Thank you.
It's a very important issue.
Important to point it out.
First of all, every type of energy has the environmental implication, right? Coal leads to pollution and use of water and many things. Coal is the most polluting. Nuclear has the big risk. Solar has the issue of the recycling of and end of life of the panels and the batteries and the other parts. So it is important to develop the end of life system so that at the end, the panels are recycled and the parts are reused. There is a market incentive to do this because the parts are valuable. But the government could also play some role to make sure that this is happening. If there is, so it should not be allowed to put the battery into the environment without the proper processing. So this is the responsibility of the industry, but also government has a role to make sure that the end of life cycle will be environmentally sensible and sustainable. This is a big issue, and it will be bigger and bigger, and not just Indonesia, around the whole world. How to make sure that the market is working well in a sustainable way and the batteries are recycled. Again, some of the parts are valuable, so the market will want to recycle it. But if not, there needs to be strong environmental rules to make sure that it's not causing a problem.
Any more questions? Not yet?
These are good questions.
I have one comment actually, and maybe I'd like to hear your view on this. If you look again the list of the barriers that you outline, maybe I can have a liberty of dividing it into two groups. The first one is the barriers that general. It means that's not only in the sector of on the renewable energy sector, but actually the barrier that was faced by all kind of sectors in Indonesia, like investment risk, and then institutional things. I think that's the barriers that all kind of sectors has faced in Indonesia in terms of the investing. But there are also one other group, which is the barrier that are kind of specific to the sectors. But it is nice if you can, if we look again your last slide, maybe you can see the last slide. Yeah, the last. Yeah, this one. Yeah, this one. Now, this is your last slide. So the key is, I mean, among those barriers. So if you can summarize into this is exactly the point. So to be able to learn the success of from India, then we have to be able to have a good marriage between two big institutions. The first is the government, and then the second one is the private sectors, the market, the private sector basically. So, and you know, marriage can be a success and can be a failure. So what I mean is, if you can be a Batman and Robin, become a dynamic duo, but you have to consider too that the relationship between market and government can be not only dynamic, but can also be destructive. You mean that in Indonesia, institutional factor is important. So the example of destructive marriage between government and private sector in the resource sector is copper in 1960s. The problem last long until now. The Freeport and kind of thing, that because the bad institutions. You can have a collusions between government, not government, but some people within the government that can take advantage of the hole in the systems to take up their own benefit, and corruption and things like that. So I know this is sensitive, but I think I want to know your view, or based on what happened in India, because India and Indonesia share also similar thing that you didn't actually mention, democracy. It's a very big democracy, and also demokrasinya ramai juga ya. India is sometimes can be divisive, and Indonesia too. Yeah? Every 5 years we are divided, for example. Yeah? So this we have in Indonesia and India share similar kind of. Indonesia new, but maybe India has been there for a while. The democratic system has been there for a while, but Indonesia new. But I think what is the institutions quality in India that we don't have, that may explain the success of India, but we may not have, or we have to focus more on it. I know this is sensitive, but maybe you can share your view on this.
Both countries have challenges in this area,
okay,
right? So when you look at the international ease of doing business or corruption rankings, both countries have challenges actually. But for this sector, solar and wind, India has set up, and you can see it in the indexes, India has set up a much more attractive environment for the investors, including the foreign investors in the sector. You know, for many sectors, Indonesia may be more attractive than India. Yeah, Indonesia, for hotel sector, for example, Indonesia can be an attractive place for investors. But for solar and wind, then not yet. You mentioned about the corruption and collusion. You know, coal is, the competitor to solar and wind is coal. Lobby. Yeah, so if you want to talk about such issues, then coal is the big one. Yeah. And this is also creating the challenge for solar and wind. How to switch. It can be challenging. Energy mix does not change overnight. The old business does not change overnight. So, and we have this in Australia as well. So, how to facilitate the change? In the end, history is written by technology, the markets, and the government decisions. So, if the technology is good enough, one day Indonesia will switch. right? If it's truly cheaper and better, then one day Indonesia will switch, of course.
So you're an optimist.
So in the long run, I'm an optimist. In the short run, maybe not.
Yeah, because
But you know what Keynes said about the long
I
run.
have to learn a lot from you, yeah.
Yeah, but so I guess the chance is there, but the issues you're talking about form a big challenge. But you know, India is not. It's not easier. It's not an easier place than Indonesia. It's challenging for land issues and other things. It's a challenging place, but the government has shown leadership for some certain things and have had some success.
Good. So we have now other thing that we can learn from India other than movies. Yeah?
Hey, Bollywood is good, right?
Oh, yeah. Anyway, I think we come to the end of the seminar. Oh, what is it? Oh, we have questions from the social media. So okay, we have questions from Pak Ahmad Kamarul Zaman. The question is, currently PLN monopolize the electricity in Indonesia. In order to increase the share of renewable energy, will it better to open the market to be more competitive? So that's the question. I think my related question to that is regarding your green certificate. Yeah? You reckon before to that in India, the fact that there are many PLNs is a good thing, but I'm not so sure about that.
In India, it's challenging.
It's a challenge. But in Indonesia, only one. So don't you think if we only have one, we'll have peer effect because of this incentive thing? So collusion is even bigger compared to where you have many PLN, so they can compete or they have strong incentive effect in terms of the peer effect. So maybe that's also relevant to this question about monopolization of PLN. What is your view on this?
It's a big question. Splitting up and having more utilities does not necessarily help solar and wind. It could make it worse. So the link between that and solar and wind is not so strong. So we do not specifically have the comment on this or recommendation. But looking to the future, for all countries, let me say it like this. More and more, the electricity grid will become like the street. It is the grid for the transport of electrons that want to go around. Just like the street is a grid for the transport of vehicles. So more and more countries have the challenge of moving to the open access grid. So more and more the utility will be in charge of grid management. Grid management means moving the electron around and keeping the lights on. More and more, ideally in Indonesia, this would happen. So the grid would be managed by a very competent utility. It's a tough job, really tough job. Respect them. But it will be more open access. So the suppliers will be feeding in solar from everywhere, from the supermarket roof, from the professor roof, from many roofs, the solar will be feeding in. On the demand side, many people are taking the electron out. So what is the job that we need PLN to do? It is more and more provide a really good grid and the grid management service, providing the stability in the grid. It's a really hard task and it sounds like enough for one utility. So currently PLN, maybe I'll talk about it vertically. Currently PLN is generating as well. Maybe this part is not quite so needed. Indonesia does have IPP, independent power producer, but in the vertical aspect, maybe PLN does not need to be involved in so much of the generation. But PLN really has a big duty for the grid management. And splitting PLN into different ones for different regions might not help this. So, yeah, I think that PLN is a vital agency and it's doing some good, excellent achievements. For example, more households being connected. But the key thing is suppliers should be able to set up the project and put it into the grid as easily as possible with as little requirement for the license as possible and able to sell the electrons on the grid. Yeah, so I think that cutting PLN is a big one. Maybe don't recommend this in the short term, but in the long run, the electricity sector is changing a lot. Key job for the utility is grid management. Yeah.
Great. Is there any plan to present this to the policy people?
Yes, next week in Jakarta, I will present a seminar at University of Indonesia, and we will have some very top discussants, including from the government.
I saw Pak Monty there, right? Will be there. Yeah, okay.
Pak Monty and Pak Harris.
So this is a rehearsal, okay?
This is the rehearsal. And yes, so everyone is welcome to attend the FKP seminar next week at University of Indonesia, Salemba campus.
Okay.
And also please contact me on email if you would like to raise a question or discussion. And I'm happy to share slides as well.
Yeah, that's great, because what you are presenting is very important to be heard by the ministries. So, and I saw that in the FKP ad, there are at least 3 people from the ministry is discussing your work. I think that's a good thing. Okay, let's give a big applause to Paul. Thank you for coming here, Paul. And then I close this session by saying Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.